Victor Thorne raised the champagne flute, the polished crystal reflecting the city's glittering chaos, a perfect mirror of his own soaring ambition. He beamed at his fiancée, Serafina Vance, before turning to the hundreds of expectant faces. "To the future," his voice boomed, smooth as expensive whiskey, "and to shedding the dead weight that once anchored me." She was a footnote, nothing more, a lazy distraction from my empire building. I'm the king of this castle because I finally cut her loose. As the applause swelled, Victor tasted pure, unadulterated triumph. He was untouchable. He didn't see the massive glass doors silently swing open, revealing the very ghost he had just ridiculed, looking like royalty and escorted by the one man who could utterly destroy Victor's meticulously crafted life, Malcolm Sterling, the enigmatic CEO. The air in the crystal atrium, 3 stories of dazzling Chicago modernity, felt less like breathable oxygen and more like distilled success. It was a space designed to impress, intimidate, and confirm hierarchy. Beneath a breathtaking kinetic sculpture that shimmered like a suspended galaxy of diamonds, the city's true power brokers, the architects of finance, the titans of tech, the keepers of old money, mingled. This was the engagement celebration of Victor Thorne and Serafina Vance, and tonight Victor intended to collect the applause he believed he was owed. Victor Thorne, at 35, looked like the physical manifestation of corporate aspiration. His custom Italian suit fit with such precision that it seemed less tailored and more surgically applied. His jawline was sharp, his smile practiced, and his dark hair was sculpted with the kind of meticulous care that suggested both relentless ambition and absolute control. Tonight, the success was thick on him, a potent, intoxicating aroma that overpowered his expensive cologne. He was the senior vice president at Sterling Innovations, a title he had worn like a crown for 3 years. But his true coronation, the one that validated his entire existence, was happening now, beside Serafina Vance. Serafina was not merely beautiful, she was an asset class. Blonde, poised, and draped in a gown the precise shade of old gold, she moved through the room with the practiced ease of inherited wealth. Her family name, Vance, wasn't just famous. It was institutional, carved into the lintels of libraries and the marble halls of Chicago's philanthropic elite. She looked at Victor not with doe-eyed romance, but with the cool, quiet satisfaction of a shrewd investor watching a speculative venture pay off handsomely. Her hand rested on his forearm, a possessive, calculated pressure. Victor spent the first hour drinking in the praise, each compliment a validation of the lie he had built. He felt a potent, nearly physical surge of power. The champagne was flowing, the jazz trio played a soft, calculated rhythm, and the city lights outside the towering windows were his backdrop. It was time for the main event. He stepped onto the small elevated platform, the polished wood reflecting the overhead lights, and tapped a silver fork against his glass. The room quieted, the murmured conversations dying like embers. He waited, drawing out the silence, making the elite wait for his voice. This wasn't just a toast, it was his narrative, and he was the undisputed author. "Wow," Victor began, his voice dropping to a smooth, resonant timbre designed to inspire confidence and close deals. "Just wow. Look at all of you. To have our dearest friends and family here, gathered in this stunning space. It means the world to Serafina and me." He gave Serafina a smile, a flash of white teeth that didn't quite reach his eyes, and she responded with a socialite's kiss, a perfectly timed gesture for the cameras he knew were present. "I am truly the luckiest man alive," he continued, holding the room rapt. "I have the most intelligent, the most supportive partner in Serafina." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the room before returning to Serafina, confirming their combined status. Then the script shifted, veering toward the moment of calculated cruelty he had been rehearsing for weeks. A faint smirk played on his lips, a flash of cold ego. And I have a career that's, well, it's finally taken off in the way I always knew it could. It's funny how life works out. Sometimes to reach your full potential, you have to shed the dead weight. You have to cut out the things, and yes, the people, that are holding you back. A few uncomfortable coughs rippled through the older, more established members of the crowd, those who remembered his previous life, his previous marriage. Victor ignored them. He was speaking to his future, and his future didn't include the ghost of his past. "I'm not one to speak ill of the past," he lied, his eyes gleaming with blatant dishonesty. "But let's be honest, some people are just comfortable with mediocrity. They lack the vision, the drive. They're happy to coast in your slipstream, perfectly content to be a footnote in the story of your life." He sipped his champagne, the cold bubbles emboldening his already inflated ego. He felt completely untouchable. He leaned into the microphone, his voice lowering conspiratorially, painting the precise, cruel picture he wanted the world to remember. "I remember," he said, the cruel chuckle vibrating in his throat. "Back when Serafina and I were just starting, I was working on the initial pitch for the Chimera project. For those of you who don't know, that's the foundational software that earned me my first major promotion at Sterling. I was pulling 20-hour days, living on coffee and sheer desperate will. I came home one night, brain absolutely fried, and I saw her, my ex-wife, Evelyn, Evie. She was sitting on the couch watching some mindless reality TV show, completely glazed over. She looked up at me from the sofa, and do you know what she asked?" He shook his head, feigning a weary disappointment that felt profoundly dramatic. "Are you done with your little computer game yet?" The line landed with a ripple of laughter from his newer, corporate-climbing colleagues who only knew Victor Thorne, the success story. "A little computer game," Victor repeated, emphasizing the absurdity. "That game is now the core logistics division software for Sterling Innovations. But that was the difference between us. Vision. I saw the future. She saw a distraction from her television show. I was building an empire, and she was worried about who was getting voted off the island." Serafina squeezed his arm, her expression a perfect mask of faux pity for his bygone hardship. "So I guess what I'm really saying is, thank you," Victor concluded, raising his glass higher, the city lights reflecting in its base. "Thank you to everyone who believed in me. And a special thank you, wherever she is, to my ex-wife for showing me exactly what I didn't want in a partner. She was the anchor I had to cut loose to finally let my ship sail. To Serafina, to the future, and to shedding the dead weight." The applause was deafening, a mixture of genuine enthusiasm from those who bought his manufactured legend, and polite, calculating obligation from those who knew better but wouldn't dare challenge the man of the hour. Victor stood on the platform, a conquering hero basking in the fabricated glow. He was on top of the world. His past was buried. His future was golden. The woman who knew the truth was a nobody, probably sitting alone in her tiny apartment, exactly where she belonged. It was in that precise, supreme moment of arrogance, as the applause began its inevitable, drawn-out fade, that the great glass doors at the far end of the crystal atrium swung silently open. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't a gradual change. It was a physical drop in pressure, a vacuum effect that sucked the lingering applause and conversation into oblivion. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned one by one, a slow-motion, chilling chain reaction of disbelief, all drawn to the entrance. Standing there was Evelyn Reed. But it was not the Evie of Victor's cruel caricature. It was not the mousy, defeated homebody he had spent the last year meticulously describing. The woman in the doorway was a vision of quiet, understated power. She wore a bespoke gown in a startling shade of deep emerald green, a color that made her skin luminous and complemented the dark, lustrous waves of her hair, which fell over one shoulder with effortless elegance. Her face, which Victor had once dismissed as uninspired, was composed, holding a calm authority that was more commanding than any shout. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The collective gasp from the Chicago elite was almost audible. This was a resurrection. Victor's jaw literally fell open. The champagne flute in his hand tilted precariously, and a small stream of expensive bubbles spilled onto the pristine white stage, an awkward, pathetic stain against the backdrop of his triumph. Serafina's perfectly manicured smile evaporated, replaced by a tight, hostile glare. She saw not a wronged ex-wife, but a sudden, inexplicable rival to her perfectly structured life. But the true shock, the one that sent a tremor of genuine existential fear through Victor, wasn't just Evie's presence. It was the man whose arm she held. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. His hair was streaked with a distinguished silver at the temples, and his face was one Victor only ever saw on the cover of Forbes or in the company's annual reports. It was Malcolm Sterling, the reclusive, enigmatic and utterly formidable billionaire founder and CEO of Sterling Innovations. A man who famously avoided social events. A man who hadn't attended his own company's holiday party in 5 years. A man who was, by every conceivable measure, the most powerful person in Victor's professional universe. And he was standing there, holding the door for Victor's so-called mediocre ex-wife, his expression one of quiet, protective intimacy. The jazz trio, sensing the seismic shift, faltered and fell silent. The only sound was the faint, relentless hum of the city outside the glass walls. Malcolm and Evie didn't rush in. They surveyed the stunned room with unhurried grace, their combined presence creating a gravitational pull that bent the entire party toward them. They were not crashing the party, they were claiming it. Victor, his face a sickly shade of pale, scrambled down from the stage, nearly tripping over the spilled champagne. Serafina followed, her movements stiff with fury. "Victor, what is the meaning of this? What is she doing here?" Serafina hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. I don't know," Victor stammered, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene. He felt a desperate need to seize control of the narrative to re-establish his dominance. He straightened his tie and marched toward them, trying to project an authority he did not feel. "Evie," he said, his voice straining to sound casual. What a surprise. Evie's eyes, a deep, intelligent brown, met his. There was no anger in them, no pain, just a cool, level assessment that made him feel like an insect under a microscope. "Victor," she said, her voice even and clear. "Serafina, congratulations on your engagement." But it was Malcolm Sterling who spoke next, his voice cutting through the tension like a shard of ice. "Thorn," he said, his tone deceptively mild. He didn't offer a handshake. He looked from Victor to the stage and back again. "We were just parking. Caught the end of your speech. It was illuminating." Victor's heart hammered against his ribs. "Mr. Sterling, sir, I had no idea you would be... I'm honored, but..." He trailed off, a pathetic fumbling of words. "I'm sure you are," Malcolm said, his gaze unwavering. "You mentioned the Chimera project, a cornerstone of our success, as you rightly pointed out." He paused, letting the silence stretch, amplifying Victor's discomfort to an unbearable degree. "Funny you should tell that story tonight." Serafina, seeing her perfect party unraveling, decided to intervene. "Well, this is all very dramatic," she said with a brittle laugh, stepping forward. "But this is a private event. I'm not sure what you two are doing here, but..." "I invited him," Evie said simply. Her gaze shifted to Serafina, and for the first time a flicker of something sharp and dangerous appeared. "And he," she gestured to Malcolm, "invited me." Victor felt a wave of nausea. "You came together?" he asked, the words feeling foreign and absurd on his tongue. It was here that the first twist of the knife came. Evie gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. She looked at Victor, her head tilted slightly. "You know, Victor, your memory is getting worse," she said, her tone light, conversational, as if discussing the weather. But every person in the vicinity was hanging on her every word. "I remember that night with the Chimera pitch quite differently. You came home in a panic because the core algorithm had a fatal flaw and you couldn't find the bug. You said your career was over if you couldn't fix it by morning." She paused, letting the image sink in. "I wasn't watching reality TV. I was debugging the 40,000 lines of code I wrote for you. The little computer game, as you called it. I found the error in a recursive loop at 3 a.m. I fixed it, reran the simulations, and put the completed pitch deck on your desk while you were asleep." She looked him directly in the eye, the luminous green of her gown a stark contrast to the sickly paleness of his face. "Don't you remember? You took all the credit for my all-nighter in your performance review that year. You said it was a testament to your unrelenting dedication." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Victor's carefully constructed narrative, the very foundation of the evening, had just been demolished with a few calm, factual sentences. He hadn't just been exposed as cruel, he had been exposed as a fraud. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. He looked at the faces of his colleagues, who were now staring at him with a dawning, horrified understanding. He looked at Serafina, whose expression had morphed from anger to utter contempt. And finally, he looked at Malcolm Sterling, the man who owned his future, whose face was a mask of cold, unreadable judgment. The king of the glass castle was naked, and the ghost he thought he'd buried was holding a scepter. To truly understand the depth of Victor's terror in that moment, one had to grasp the very architecture of the lie he had built his life upon. It wasn't merely a professional exaggeration, it was the entire blueprint of his existence. And Evelyn Reed, the woman he had just reduced to a pathetic footnote, was its uncredited, invisible architect. Their story began not in a Chicago boardroom, but in the stale, fluorescent glow of the University of Illinois library 10 years prior. Victor was a business major, all charm, ambition, and a natural, intoxicating flair for presentations. He could sell an idea with such magnetic confidence that people genuinely wanted to believe him. The only problem was that he rarely possessed any truly original, complex ideas of his own. Evie, was the opposite. A computer science prodigy, she was quiet, introverted, and saw the world in pattern systems, elegant lines of code, and complex mathematics. While Victor was networking at mixers, effortlessly charming donors and professors, Evie was deep in the campus computer lab, losing herself in algorithms. Her mind was a place of dazzling innovation, but her voice was small, burdened by a social anxiety that made the cell feel like a physical impediment. They were a mismatch made in heaven for someone like Victor. He was the showman, she was the genius behind the curtain. He was drawn to her brilliance like a moth to a flame, initially presenting himself as her champion. "You're too brilliant to be stuck behind a screen, Evie," he would tell her, cupping her face in his hands, his eyes full of what she mistook for admiration. "You need someone like me to get your ideas out there. We're a team." And for a while, Evie believed him because she loved him, and she trusted his confidence implicitly. She hated the spotlight, and Victor offered her a safe haven, a guarantee that her work would be recognized, even if her name was secondary. Their partnership began with a class project. It was her groundbreaking concept, her code, her late-night work. But it was Victor who presented it, earning a perfect grade and the effusive admiration of the professor, Dr. Alistair Jenkins. "We did it, babe." he'd shouted, hoisting the project paper in the air, a celebratory gesture that subconsciously reinforced his role as the conqueror. Evie, content to see her work lauded, even if her name was listed second, celebrated with him. This became the insidious pattern of their life together. When he landed his first internship, it was with a detailed proposal she had written and debugged. When he got his first job at a small startup, it was by solving a complex, on-the-spot coding problem in the final interview, a problem Evie had walked him through, step by step, the night before, drawing out the logic on their kitchen whiteboard. Victor was always the face. Evie was always the engine. His manipulation was meticulous and chillingly effective, a masterclass in gaslighting. He framed it as a division of labor that played precisely to their strengths. "You're the creator, babe. I'm the closer. It's the perfect synergy," he'd coo. He systematically convinced her that her social anxiety and quiet nature were insurmountable barriers in the cutthroat corporate world. "They'd eat you alive in there," he'd say, his voice dripping with sympathetic concern. "It's better this way. We build our empire together from the inside out." The ultimate betrayal, the one that truly cemented his career trajectory at Sterling Innovations, was the genesis of Project Chimera. It wasn't just a pitch deck or a bug fix, as Evie had so gracefully understated at the engagement party. It was a fully fledged, revolutionary logistics management system that Evie conceived of and built almost entirely on her own over 6 months. Victor was a junior project manager at Sterling, tasked with a vague corporate mandate, ideating new efficiency solutions. He was hopelessly unqualified for the creative depth required. He came home every night stressed, complaining, and feeling the icy pressure to produce something spectacular or face stagnation. Evie, wanting desperately to help him, to see him succeed, took on the challenge herself. She spent her nights and weekends in a fever of creation. She designed the architecture, wrote the code for the AI-driven predictive modeling, and developed the entire user interface. She filled notebooks, not digital files, but thick, leather-bound notebooks, with flowcharts, complex equations, and handwritten code. This was her masterpiece. She called it Beacon. She chose the name because she genuinely thought the system could be a beacon, a guiding light, leading companies towards smarter, ethical decisions. The notebook that held the full original blueprint, now worn smooth from countless hours of handling, became her symbolic object, her silent, coded truth. When it was done, she presented the working prototype to Victor in their cramped apartment. He was stunned by its brilliance and completeness. "Evie, this is a billion-dollar idea," he whispered, his eyes wide with avarice, not admiration. This time, Evie insisted her name be on it. "We can present it together as a team, Victor," she said, her voice hopeful, finally feeling a surge of confidence in her own work. "This is too big. This is our future." He agreed instantly. "Of course, babe. You're the star of this show." He took her work, her code, her designs, her Beacon notebook, and told her he was scheduling a presentation with senior leadership. For a week, he told her he was socializing the concept. What he was actually doing was meticulously scrubbing her name from every file, every document, every line of metadata. He renamed the project from the humble, hopeful Beacon to the more aggressive, corporate-sounding Chimera. He rehearsed the presentation in front of the mirror, memorizing her notes, learning to speak her language of recursive loops and quantum modeling until he could deliver it as if it were his own native tongue. The day of the presentation, he told her it had been moved to a secure off-site location and that only senior VPs were allowed to attend for IP security reasons. He promised he would introduce her as the lead architect as soon as the project was greenlit. She waited at home, anxious and excited. He came home that night and popped a bottle of cheap champagne. "They loved it! We got it!" he shouted. He was promoted the next day, and the project became his identity, his calling card, the cornerstone of his power. When Evie asked when she would be brought in, the excuses began. It's too sensitive right now. HR has a process for these things. They want the project to be associated with a single strong leader to start. That's me. The promises grew thinner and colder, and a horrifying realization began to dawn on Evie. He had never intended to give her credit. Her genius was not a gift he cherished, but a resource he had plundered. When she finally confronted him, he turned on her. The charming, supportive partner vanished, replaced by a cruel, dismissive stranger. "You're being naive, Evie. This is how the world works," he sneered. "You wrote some code. I made it happen. Ideas are worthless without execution." He started belittling her again, chipping away at her confidence. He called her unambitious for not having a flashy career of her own, conveniently ignoring the fact that she had been working full-time on his. He told their friends she was becoming difficult and neurotic. The divorce was his final act of erasure. He used his new high-powered salary to hire the best lawyers, arguing that she had contributed nothing financially to the marriage. He painted her as a dependent, a simple housewife who had no claim to his hard-earned success. Beaten down, emotionally exhausted, and with limited funds to fight a prolonged legal battle, Evie walked away with next to nothing. He had not only stolen her work, he had stolen her past, her confidence, and her professional identity. He was certain he had left her so broken that she would never have the strength to challenge him. He never imagined she would find a partner who could buy and sell him 1,000 times over, or that the fragile, leather-bound Beacon notebook, the real lifeblood of Chimera, was the one piece of evidence he had forgotten to burn. Back at the engagement party, as she stood beside Malcolm Sterling, Evie wasn't just a woman at a party. She was the living, breathing, uncredited evidence of Victor's fraud. She was the ghost of his conscience, returned from the grave he had so carefully dug for her, and she was about to haunt him into oblivion. The silence that followed her revelation pulsed with lethal judgment. Every guest in the atrium became a juror, and the verdict on Victor Thorne was being delivered in their shocked, accusing stares. The silence after Evie's precise, calm statement, "You took all the credit for my all-nighter in your performance review that year," was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the collective collapse of Victor Thorne's manufactured image. His lie, the carefully curated image of a self-made man, had shattered into 1,000,000 glittering pieces on the pristine floor of his own engagement party. Victor stood frozen, a statue of pathetic denial. His mind raced desperately, trying to find a foothold in the landslide. That's a ridiculous exaggeration," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "You're twisting things. You were always so emotional." It was a weak, pathetic defense, a reflex of his old gaslighting tactics, but it was useless now. He wasn't talking to his downtrodden wife in their small apartment anymore. He was addressing a confident, poised woman flanked by a man who moved markets. Evie didn't even dignify his accusation with a direct response. She simply held his gaze, her expression calm, a more potent rebuttal than any angry words. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The humiliation was so intense that Victor felt a cold, physical sickness coil in his gut. It was Serafina who broke the spell, her voice sharp as shattered glass. "So this is what this is about," she spat, directing her fury not at Victor, but at Evie. "You couldn't stand to see him happy, so you show up here to spread lies and ruin our night. How utterly pathetic." She turned to Malcolm Sterling, her tone shifting instantly to one of fawning disbelief. "Mr. Sterling, I can't imagine why you'd associate yourself with someone so vindictive. Victor is the most honest, driven man I know." Malcolm Sterling, who had been watching the entire exchange with the quiet, predatory intensity of a jungle cat, finally moved. He took a half-step forward, and the sheer force of his presence made both Serafina and Victor flinch. "Honesty, Ms. Vance," Malcolm said, his voice low and dangerously calm, "is a quality I value above almost all others, in my business and in my life." He let his gaze drift from Serafina to Victor, and a flicker of utter cold contempt crossed his features, which is why I find this conversation so fascinating. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words carried the weight of absolute, unchallengeable authority. He turned his attention back to Victor. "Thorn, a word of advice. When you find yourself in a hole, the first rule is to stop digging." Without another word, he placed a gentle, proprietary hand on the small of Evie's back. The gesture was silent, intimate, and devastatingly clear. "I believe we've offered our congratulations," he said to Evie, his voice softening to a tone Victor had never heard him use. "Shall we?" "Of course," Evie replied, her voice steady. They turned and began to walk away, not in a rush, but with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who knew they had already won. They moved through the stunned crowd, which parted for them as if they were royalty. The emerald green of Evie's gown seemed to absorb the light, turning her into the visual center of the room. The message was clear. They hadn't come for a fight. They had come to deliver a statement, and the statement had been delivered. As they reached the doors, Evie stopped and, without turning around, addressed the room, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden echoing silence. "I left my Beacon notebook in the coat check," she stated calmly, referencing the original name of the stolen project. "Could someone please retrieve it for me?" The simple request acted as the final nail in the coffin. The party was over. The celebration had turned into a public execution. Victor was left standing in the center of the room, exposed and humiliated. His colleagues, the ones who had been clapping him on the back minutes earlier, now avoided his eyes, suddenly finding the polished floor or the soaring ceiling architecture intensely interesting. Marcus Thorne, Victor's direct superior and a senior executive VP, gave him a long, unreadable look before turning and walking briskly toward the exit, a phone already pressed to his ear. Serafina rounded on Victor, her face a mask of cold fury, all pretense of social charm gone. "How could you?" she seethed, her voice a low, vicious hiss that only he could hear. "You told me she was nothing, a nobody. You bring this humiliation to my doorstep, to my family." "Serafina, baby, listen to me," Victor pleaded, reaching for her. "She's lying. She's a bitter, jealous ex trying to ruin my life." "Lying?" Serafina scoffed, slapping his hand away with startling violence. "She showed up with Malcolm Sterling. He doesn't go anywhere for anyone, Victor. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How it makes us look?" Her concern wasn't for his integrity. It was solely for the catastrophic social fallout. Her perfect engagement, her perfect fiancé, were now contaminated. The Vance brand was tarnished. "I will fix this," Victor insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'll talk to Sterling on Monday. I'll clear this all up." But even as he said it, he knew he was doomed. The look in Malcolm Sterling's eyes had not been one of confusion or curiosity. It had been one of confirmation. Malcolm had walked in, not seeking information, but delivering a verdict. The king of the glass castle was now merely a fool caught in his own web. Evie and Malcolm were gone, but the ghost they left behind was already beginning to dismantle the throne. Victor Thorne's assumption that Evie's appearance was a spontaneous, vindictive act by a jealous ex-wife was his final, fatal error. He couldn't grasp that this was not a social ambush, but the culmination of a systematic, 6-week-long corporate investigation personally led by the founder of Sterling Innovations. The journey began not with Evie, but with a piece of paper lost in the vast digital machinery of Sterling. About 2 months prior, Malcolm Sterling's internal IP audit team had flagged an unsigned proposal of extraordinary genius. It was a document detailing a new theoretical logistics system codenamed Beacon 2.0, leveraging quantum modeling, technology a full generation ahead of anything currently in development. The conceptual framework and, more specifically, the raw, elegant coding style bore a striking, almost identical resemblance to the foundational code of Project Chimera. Yet the official reports on Chimera, the reports Victor Thorne had submitted, were glossy, well-worded, but technically shallow. The contrast was stark. Malcolm Sterling, a man obsessed with true innovation, wasn't confused. He was suspicious. He knew the difference between a genius and a charismatic mouthpiece. His skepticism of Victor had been growing for months. Victor's subsequent projects were pedestrian and lacked the spark of Chimera. "We are looking for a ghost," Malcolm had told his chief technical officer, Dr. Anya Sharma, a brilliant but fiercely pragmatic woman. "A brilliant ghost who created our most profitable software and then simply vanished from our ecosystem. Find the source." Dr. Sharma's team conducted a deep-dive forensic audit. They went back through old server logs, retrieved fragmented data from decommissioned drives, and, crucially, analyzed the keystroke dynamics from the original coding sessions of Chimera's initial draft. The digital breadcrumbs did not lead to Victor's company laptop or his personal account. They all led to an external residential IP address, the apartment Victor had shared with his then-wife, Evie. The keystroke signature, analyzed through proprietary AI tools, confirmed a different typist, one whose speed and pattern were consistent with a prodigious coder, not a management executive. 6 weeks ago, Malcolm Sterling had the proof. He held the digital confession to Victor Thorne's 7-year-long fraud. Malcolm hadn't sought out Evie for a date. He sought her out for a job. He didn't want to accuse Victor publicly. He wanted to neutralize the threat and secure the true asset. The first meeting between Malcolm and Evie was not romantic, but clinical, held in a discreet private conference room downtown. Evie was hesitant, distrustful of any corporate entity, but the data, the sheer irrefutable evidence of her own code laid bare, was impossible to ignore. "Ms. Reed," Malcolm had said, his voice quiet, stripped of his usual corporate aloofness, "my team believes you are the true architect of Project Chimera, and based on this proposal," he gestured to the Beacon 2.0 draft, "you are also the future of my company. Victor Thorne is a thief, and I intend to correct the record." Evie, initially defensive, had finally cracked open the leather-bound Beacon notebook, her symbolic object, which held the entire original handwritten architecture of Chimera. The sheer detail, the elegance of the math, and the time-stamped dates within the notebook were the physical, undeniable proof that corroborated the digital forensics. "I didn't seek you out for retribution, Evie," Malcolm confessed, his tone sincere. "I sought you out for a job, a very big job." He explained the proposal, the full, unreserved restoration of her intellectual property, a public correction of the record, and the offer to head a completely new, independently funded advanced research and development division, a skunk works, where she could develop her vision without corporate interference. The relationship had developed from that point. The mutual respect, his admiration for her undeniable, pure intellect, and her appreciation for his rare, unpatronizing integrity, formed a bond that was deeper and more solid than the transactional nature of Victor's world. The quiet dinners and conversations that followed were about quantum tunneling and predictive modeling, not about social status or corporate maneuvering. Evie's decision to appear at the engagement party was Malcolm's idea, but her execution was her own. "You need to reclaim the narrative, Evie," Malcolm advised her days before the party. "Victor built his identity on the theft of your story. Simply firing him isn't enough. You need to be the one to dismantle the lie in front of the people who believed it." Evie realized Malcolm was right. The deepest wound Victor had inflicted wasn't the theft of money. It was the attempted murder of her potential. The gaslighting had been the true crime. Her appearance at the party wasn't just revenge. It was an act of public self-reclamation, a declaration of her own worth in the very space where Victor had tried to erase her. By the time she stepped through the doors of the Crystal Atrium, she was not just an ex-wife. She was a strategic partner, a technical genius, and an adversary armed with the truth and backed by the most powerful man in the room. Her quiet composure was the calm before the corporate storm that would break over Victor Thorne on Monday morning. The following Monday at the Sterling Innovations Tower felt like a walk to the gallows for Victor Thorne. The normal morning buzz in the lobby was replaced by an eerie quiet whenever he walked past. People would stop talking and stare, their whispers a cold sensation on the back of his neck. The news of the party and Evie's bombshell revelation had spread through the corporate grapevine at light speed, gaining the title The Emerald Takedown. Victor made it to his corner suite, an office with a panoramic view that had once made him feel powerful, but now felt sickeningly like a cage. He tried to work, but his hands were shaking. His inbox was suspiciously empty. The usual torrent of morning emails from his team and superiors, the requests, the dependencies, the essential corporate chatter had been reduced to a trickle. He was being iced out. Just before noon, the call he had been dreading came. It wasn't from Marcus Thorne, his direct superior. It was from Malcolm Sterling's executive assistant, a woman with a voice so crisp and efficient it could make you shiver, Ms. Clarissa Lowe. "Mr. Thorne, Mr. Sterling requests your presence in the main boardroom on the 50th floor immediately. Do not be late." His blood ran cold. The 50th floor was executive territory where the real gods of the company resided. He had only been there once before for his final VP interview, and it had felt like an audience with royalty. With his heart pounding a funeral drum against his ribs, Victor took the elevator up. Every floor he passed felt like another layer of his stolen life being stripped away. When the doors opened onto the 50th floor, he stepped out into a hushed, cathedral-like space of polished marble and dark mahogany. A security guard he had never seen before wordlessly guided him down a corridor. He was led to the boardroom, a massive room dominated by a shining mahogany table that could seat 30 people, currently bathed in the intimidating silent light of the Chicago skyline. The door was opened and Victor walked in. Seated around the massive table were Malcolm Sterling, Marcus Thorne, and the company's chief legal counsel, Mr. Alan Finch. But that wasn't the second twist. The second twist, the one that truly extinguished the last ember of hope in Victor's soul, was who was sitting to Malcolm Sterling's right, looking through a tablet with an air of calm, composed authority. It was Evie Reed. She wasn't there as a guest or a +1. She was there as a principal. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, a uniform of quiet power, and she barely spared Victor a glance. Malcolm Sterling gestured to the single empty chair at the far end of the table, making Victor sit as far away from the power center as possible. "Thorne," Malcolm said, his tone all business, chillingly devoid of emotion. "Thank you for joining us." Victor sat, his legs feeling weak. "Mr. Sterling, sir, I can explain about the party. We have some business to discuss regarding Project Chimera," Malcolm interrupted, cutting through Victor's pathetic attempt at damage control. "I've been conducting a comprehensive review of our key intellectual properties, and some inconsistencies have come to light regarding Chimera's origins." He looked at Evie. "As you may or may not know, I've been trying to identify the brilliant mind behind a new R&D initiative codenamed Beacon." Malcolm used the original hopeful name, a deliberate dagger twist. It was an unsigned proposal of extraordinary genius that was flagged by our internal IP auditors 6 weeks ago. Malcolm spoke with the measured cadence of a prosecutor presenting a flawless case. The conceptual framework and coding style bore a striking resemblance to the foundational code of Chimera. Yet it was demonstrably more advanced. The official reports on Chimera, your reports, Thorne, were polished, but the raw code, the early drafts, they had a unique signature, an elegance that frankly didn't match any of your subsequent, more pedestrian work. Malcolm slid a thick file across the table. "My team conducted a deep dive audit. We went back through old server logs, retrieved fragmented data from decommissioned drives, and even analyzed the keystroke dynamics from the original coding sessions." Victor's heart hammered against his ribs. Keystroke dynamics. He had never even considered that. "We were looking for a ghost," Malcolm continued, his eyes locking onto Victor's. "A brilliant ghost who created our most profitable software and then simply vanished. The digital breadcrumbs didn't lead to you, Thorne. They all led to an external IP address, an address that we traced back to the apartment you shared with your then-wife, Evelyn Reed." Malcolm gestured to Evie. "So I sought out the ghost. I found Ms. Reed, and I showed her our findings. I wanted to know if she was the true architect of Chimera. She confirmed that she was. More importantly, she showed me her original notebooks for Beacon, the architectural blueprints that she had conceived years ago, long before you ever started at Sterling." Victor stared at Evie, his mouth agape. She held the leather-bound Beacon notebook in her lap, the symbol of his betrayal, now the instrument of his destruction. "It turns out my new favorite R&D proposal wasn't new at all. It was the sequel to Chimera that you were never smart enough to even imagine." Malcolm's voice dropped to a low, chilling register. "I didn't seek Evie out for a date, Thorne. I sought her out for a job. 3 weeks ago I hired her to be the new head of our entire Advanced Research and Development Skunkworks division." He paused, letting the silence scream. "The relationship," Malcolm added with a pointed look at Evie, "developed after we discovered a shared passion for innovation and a shared disdain for fraud." Victor felt the floor drop out from beneath him. This wasn't a spontaneous act of petty revenge. This was a meticulous, systematic investigation. He hadn't just been caught at a party. He had been hunted, discovered, and exposed by the most powerful man he had ever known. His lie hadn't just been revealed. It had been scientifically disproven. The boardroom on the 50th floor felt like a courtroom and an operating theatre combined. Victor was on trial, and his career was being methodically dissected without anesthesia. The weight of Malcolm Sterling's revelation pressed down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. The ghost in the machine had testified against him. Marcus Thorne, Victor's former direct superior, who had remained silent until now, pushed the thick audit binder across the mahogany table. His face was devoid of the usual professional warmth. It was the cold, distant expression of a man severing a limb to save the body. "This is the complete audit report, Victor," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Server logs, time-stamped code commits from her IP address, drafts of the proposal with metadata pointing to her laptop. It even includes a linguistic analysis comparing the technical language in the Chimera proposal to your other written work. The difference is, and I quote the report, statistically staggering." Victor stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't need to open it. He was the author of his own fiction, and he knew exactly how it ended. Malcolm Sterling leaned back in his chair, a study in controlled, glacial power. "The lie is impressive. I'll give you that, Thorne. The sheer audacity to take credit for a work of genius like Chimera, to build your entire career on it. It requires a certain kind of pathological ambition. But that kind of ambition is a cancer in a company like this. We are built on innovation and integrity. You have made a mockery of both." It was then that Evie spoke. She hadn't looked at Victor with pity or anger, but with a kind of detached finality, like a scientist observing a failed experiment. "The lie wasn't just about the credit, Malcolm," she said, addressing her boss, but ensuring Victor heard every word. "It was about suppression. To maintain the lie, he had to ensure the true source could never emerge. He had to convince me that my ideas were worthless, that I was worthless. The real crime wasn't just the theft of my work, but the attempted murder of my potential." Her words were calm, precise, and utterly devastating. They reframed his crime from mere plagiarism to something far more sinister and personal. He hadn't just stolen from her, he had tried to break her spirit to cover his tracks. Finally, the dam of Victor's composure broke. The smug executive persona dissolved, revealing the desperate, terrified man beneath. "Evie, please," he begged, turning to her, his voice cracking. Don't do this. We had years together. We were a team. I was trying to get us ahead. For us. It was a pathetic last-ditch appeal to a shared history he himself had desecrated. Evie looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time in that room. There was no us, Victor, she said, her voice firm, but without malice. There was only you and your ambition, and me, the resource you exploited to feed it. You didn't just take my code, you took my confidence. You tried to make me small so you could feel big. The team you're talking about was a fiction you created to justify a heist. She then turned her attention back to the board, all business once again. As the new head of Advanced R&D, my first initiative will be to launch Beacon 2.0. It will leverage the core principles of the original Chimera code, but integrate quantum modeling and predictive AI, pushing our logistics efficiency into the next decade. I have the roadmap laid out. She pushed her tablet toward the center of the table, and schematics and projections of breathtaking complexity and vision filled the screen. She was showcasing the brilliance he had tried to extinguish, and it was burning brighter than ever. That was her ultimate vindication, not a scream or a tear, but an undeniable, irrefutable demonstration of her superior intellect. She wasn't just reclaiming her past, she was claiming the company's future. Malcolm Sterling watched her with a look of profound admiration before turning his cold, final gaze on Victor. "Victor Thorne," he said, the name sounding like a verdict. "You are terminated from Sterling Innovations effective immediately for gross misconduct, willful misrepresentation of qualifications, and intellectual property theft." He wasn't finished. "Our legal department," he continued, gesturing to Mr. Finch, the legal counsel, "will be in contact with your lawyer. We will be initiating clawback proceedings to recover all bonuses and stock options granted to you on the basis of your fraudulent work on the Chimera project. That amounts to, I believe, 7 years of compensation." Victor's face went white. This wasn't just firing him. This was financially ruining him. They were erasing him from the company's history and its payroll. "Furthermore," Malcolm added, "a formal company-wide memo will be circulated this afternoon, correcting the record on the attribution of Project Chimera. Ms. Reed will be publicly credited as its sole architect. We believe in setting the record straight." He was being unpersoned. His one great claim to fame was being publicly stripped from him and handed to its rightful owner. He would be a laughingstock, a cautionary tale. "Security will now escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings. You will then be escorted from the building," Malcolm said, his tone final. He had already dismissed Victor from his mind and turned back to Evie. "Now, about the budget for Beacon 2.0. As two stern-faced security guards entered the room, Victor felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. His world had completely inverted. The woman he had mocked as a mediocre nobody was now discussing multi-million-dollar budgets with his boss. The life he had stolen was being returned to its owner with interest. As he was led from the room in disgrace, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Serafina's personal assistant. It was a screenshot of a press release already sent to the society pages. Headline: Vance Thorne engagement mutually terminated. Serafina. Vance and Victor Thorne have mutually agreed to end their engagement. Ms. Vance wishes Mr. Thorne the best in his future endeavors, but has come to realize, due to recent revelations of fraudulent representations, that their paths forward are no longer aligned. She will be spending the coming weeks focusing on her philanthropic work abroad. It was a cold, brutal, and public severing. She hadn't even had the decency to tell him herself. His fiancé, his job, his reputation, his money, all gone in the space of 3 days. The ship he had so proudly boasted about had not just been anchored, it had been scuttled, and he was going down with it all alone in the cold, dark water. 6 months felt like a lifetime. From the 50th floor of the Sterling Innovations Tower, the city of Chicago sprawled out like a circuit board of infinite possibility. It was a view Evie now saw not as an intimidating landscape, but as a territory of her own making. Her office, the very one that had once been the command center for another executive, had been transformed. The dark mahogany and leather had been replaced with clean lines, glass walls that fostered transparency, and massive whiteboards covered in complex equations that married mathematics with poetry. Prototypes of sleek, unidentifiable gadgets sat on shelves next to thriving green plants, softening the space. It was a space that hummed with quiet, focused energy, her energy. This morning, she was at the head of a large oval table, leading the weekly progress meeting for the Beacon 2.0 initiative. Her team, a hand-picked collection of the brightest and most audacious minds in tech, was engaged in a heated but respectful debate about the quantum encryption framework. "The decay rate is still too unpredictable," said Ben Carter, a young Caltech graduate with unruly hair. "If we can't guarantee stability, the entire security framework is compromised." "What if we're looking at it backwards?" Evie interjected, her voice calm but commanding. She stood and walked to the main whiteboard, picking up a marker. "Instead of trying to prevent the decay, what if we use the unpredictability itself as a feature? What if each quantum state's decay pattern becomes a unique, one-time encryption key, impossible to replicate because it's inherently random?" The room fell silent for a beat, a collective intake of breath as her team processed the paradigm shift. Ben's eyes widened. "A self-destructing, constantly evolving key. That's brilliant. It's fundamentally unbreakable." A genuine, unburdened grin spread across Evie's face. "Let's break it down." This was her new reality, a world where her ideas weren't whispered in desperation to a deceitful husband, but celebrated and built upon by a team that revered her intellect. The self-doubt Victor had so meticulously installed in her psyche was still there, a faint echo in the back of her mind on quiet nights, but its voice was growing weaker every day. It was being drowned out by the chorus of her own success, by the tangible proof of her capabilities that surrounded her. She was not just a manager, she was a leader, a visionary. For the first time in her adult life, her professional identity was wholly and indisputably her own. Later that afternoon, the door to her office slid open. Malcolm Sterling entered, holding 2 coffee cups, a familiar ritual that had become a cherished part of their routine. He no longer looked at her with the calculating eye of a CEO who had found a valuable asset, but with an easy, unguarded affection that was more precious to her than any stock option. "Fuel for the revolutionary," he said, placing a cup on her desk. He gestured to the whiteboards, which now looked like the beautiful chaos of a supernova. "Just trying to make sure our client's data doesn't get stolen by supervillains," she quipped, her shoulders relaxing in his presence. "How was the quarterly earnings call?" "Profitable," he said, leaning against her desk, "but profoundly boring compared to this. Our stock price jumped 3% when I mentioned the preliminary findings from Beacon. The street is calling you the Oracle of Sterling." Evie chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "Don't let it go to your head. I still need you to approve my budget." His smile was warm and full of admiration. "Evie, at this point you could tell me you needed to build a research facility on the moon, and I'd just ask you if you preferred a direct or connecting flight." He became more serious, his hand gently covering hers on the desk. "This is what I saw in that initial proposal. This mind, this fire. I'm just the guy who was smart enough to get out of its way." Their relationship had become a sanctuary for them both. For her, it was the discovery that a man could be strong without being domineering, supportive without being patronizing. For him, a man accustomed to a world of cold, transactional relationships, it was the discovery of a partnership so complete it felt like coming home. "Speaking of flights," he said, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles, "I've been thinking. There's a little island off the coast of Italy that has no cell service, no internet, and the best pasta you've ever tasted. We could go next month, disconnect for a week." She looked into his eyes and saw her future. A future of shared adventures, quiet moments, and boundless respect. "I'd love that," she said, her voice soft, closing the old, worn Beacon notebook that sat on her desk, the final proof that she had mastered her own destiny. "I'm finally where I was always meant to be." Miles away in a soul-crushing expanse of suburban asphalt, Victor Thorne sat in the driver's seat of his 3-year-old Toyota Camry. The engine was off. He was staring at the drab grey facade of Innovate Office Solutions, a name so generic it was insulting. His downfall hadn't been a dramatic, fiery crash, but a slow, grinding descent into mediocrity. The company-wide memo from Sterling Innovations had acted like a neutron bomb, destroying his reputation while leaving the building standing. He was blacklisted. The story of his public humiliation at the hands of his ex-wife and her billionaire boyfriend became the stuff of legend, a schadenfreude-laden cautionary tale told over expensive lunches he could no longer afford. The claw-back lawsuit had been merciless, stripping him of his condo, his leased luxury car, and his savings. His entire net worth had been built on a lie, and the truth had repossessed it all. His new job was a daily exercise in humiliation. He sold second-rate printers and bulk toner cartridges to people who wouldn't have been allowed to schedule a meeting with his assistant in his old life. Today had been particularly brutal. He'd had a meeting with a mid-level office manager, a woman who had spent the entire pitch scrolling through her phone. As he was packing up his presentation materials, his hands fumbling with the cheap binder, she had looked up. "You look really familiar," she'd said, squinting. "Did you used to be somebody?" The question had twisted in his gut like a dull knife. "I was your boss's boss's boss," he wanted to scream. Instead, he just shook his head and muttered, "No, just have one of those faces, I guess." Now, sitting in the deafening quiet of his car, the facade crumbled. The arrogance was gone, leaving a hollowed-out shell. In its place was a simmering, pathetic rage. He still didn't see his own fault in the catastrophe. In the twisted narrative of his mind, he was the victim. Evie was the vindictive shrew who couldn't let him be happy. Malcolm Sterling was the predator who had stolen his life to get to her. He had been on the verge of greatness, and they had conspired to drag him down into this beige hell. His phone buzzed. A generic, irritating notification from a news app. He tapped on it. The headline read, "Sterling Innovations soars on Beacon 2.0 hype. Head of R&D, Evelyn Reed, hailed as tech visionary." Below it was a picture of her and Malcolm at a recent tech gala. They weren't trying to project power. They were simply laughing, radiating a relaxed confidence that made Victor's blood boil. She was incandescently happy, respected, powerful, everything he had ever wanted to be, everything he had pretended to be. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat as if it had burned him. The ghost of his former life was not just haunting him, it was thriving, celebrating on a world stage while he was suffocating in a parking lot in Schaumburg, Illinois. He had tried to erase her, to reduce her to a footnote in his story. Instead, he had become a footnote in hers, the pathetic, forgotten villain in the epic tale of her rise. He finally understood his punishment. It wasn't the loss of money or status. It was the crushing, eternal knowledge that he was the dead weight and she was flying, and he would be stuck on the ground forever, looking up at the light of her beacon. This isn't just a story about sweet revenge. It's a powerful reminder that true success cannot be stolen. Evelyn Reed's journey shows us that authenticity and resilience are the only non-fungible assets. Her ultimate triumph wasn't just in exposing a lie, but in reclaiming her voice and stepping into her own brilliance. It proves that a person's true character is revealed not when they're on top of the world, but when their carefully constructed world comes crashing down. If you were on the edge of your seat watching Evie get her ultimate vindication, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power, and subscribe for more true life drama.